Hey everyone, can you hear me? So it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. Gail Fraser is a professor in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University, where she teaches ecology and conservation science to non-science students. Fraser has worked on colonial nesting waterbirds for over 2 decades, including foresters' terns, crested auklets, thick-billed murres, Leach's storm petrels, and Manx shearwaters. She now works on double-crested cormorants and black-crowned night herons in Ontario. Driven by an interest in seabird conservation since 2002, she's worked on policy-oriented research on the environmental management of offshore oil and gas extraction, primarily in Eastern Canada. I'm so pleased to have her here tonight, kicking off the 44th annual and our first virtual Waterbird Society meeting. And her talk, Offshore Oil and Seabird Conservation, Lessons Learned from the Canadian Experience, pulls together about 18 years of work in this area. So please welcome Gail Fraser.
Thank you, Patty. Everybody got that? Wonderful. So thank you for inviting me. I'm going to start off, this is my outline. I've got a little bit on how I managed to get myself into doing oil and gas research, some basic background on seabirds in Newfoundland and oil in Newfoundland, and then get into some examples that demonstrate legislative and regulatory weaknesses that have failed to protect seabirds. But before I do that, I'm going to give you an environmental assessment primer, and I promise it will be short. And then I'm going to wrap up with some final thoughts and conclusions. So when I was an undergrad at the University of Minnesota, I had an opportunity to work on tagging sea otters in Prince William Sound. And I did this in 1987, which was a year and a half prior to the Exxon Valdez oil spill. So when I was back at home a year and a half later, I was watching oiled otters being pulled out of the water. And as my 21-year-old self, it was a very emotional moment for me. And that spill, which was quite substantial, ended up being, gave scientists really a paradigm shift on how long lasting some of these effects from these large spills can be, particularly in cold waters. The next, there's kind of 3 opportunities. The second one was I was at Memorial University of Newfoundland working on my PhD. And during that time, there was the second offshore oil production project environmental assessment that was going on. And I had colleagues that were involved in reviewing that EA. So there was a lot of discussions going on for that. And then also the first oil production project produced its first oil. And this was a really important time for Newfoundland and Labrador because they were shifting from a fisheries economy. The fishery completely collapsed. And there was a really dire moment around the economy. And so this was like shifting from oil to, from fisheries to oil. And then the third, aside from training and studying on colonial nesting waterbirds, was to do a postdoc with an environmental lawyer at Texas A&M in Galveston, Wendelin Von Geren. And she used to work for ExxonMobil as an environmental lawyer and was one of their leading lawyers during the the Exxon Valdez oil spill. So, and during this postdoc, I looked at comparing offshore oil and gas regulations and policies as how they apply to seabirds and comparing Canada and the US. So Newfoundland and Labrador, particularly the Grand Banks, is a huge area. It's some 500,000 square kilometers of ocean, and it's a series of banks that are quite shallow, between 51 and 100 meters in depth. And it's a low Arctic system that is highly productive. And because it's productive, it supports both regionally and globally significant numbers of seabirds. So there's been some estimated 60 species that breed or overwinter in Newfoundland and Labrador. this huge range, which it probably lands somewhere in between around 40 million. And locally, there's significant breeding sites. And there are birds that breed in the high Arctic, like dovekies, and move down off onto the Grand Banks for the winter time. There are birds that breed in Newfoundland and then just go offshore so they're there year round. And then there are birds that come from the South Atlantic and move up and forage in the summer months. So it is policy work, and so I do need to set you up with a little background on some policy. So Canada has an interesting structure. It has a provincial, federal governments, and on land, the provincial government gets to decide on how they develop their resources. But in the offshore, it's the federal government that's in charge. And so in the mid-'80s, when it looked like there was going to be oil development happening both in Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia, the federal and provincial governments came up with these joint federal provincial petroleum boards. And they're arm's length from government, but they report to government, which I'll show you in a minute. And so the one I'm dealing with entirely today is the Canada, Newfoundland, and Labrador Offshore Petroleum Board, and I'm just going to call it the regulator. And there's an act that's called the Canada, Newfoundland, and Labrador Atlantic Accord Implementation Act. Shorthand is Accord Act or Atlantic Accord. And that act is very important because it's essentially telling it created the Petroleum Board, the regulator, and it gives it all of its mandates on how it proceeds in regulating the offshore oil operators. And I wish I had discovered this early on, but it actually took me quite some time when I started wading into this research as a postdoc. This is a section of the Atlantic Accord Act that is around confidentiality. And essentially what happens is the operators, for example, are required by the Accord Act to report a spill, and they report it to the regulator. But if the regulator wants to disclose it, i.e. to the public, they have to actually ask the permission of the operator to disclose the data. So in this quote, information or documentation is privileged and shall not knowingly be disclosed without the consent of the person, i.e. corporation, who provided it, which gives the operators quite a bit of power. And the other, I guess, semi-important thing is that there's mirror legislation. So the province has this legislation and the federal government has this legislation, which means it's extra difficult to change the act. So I'm only talking about one particular part of this very complicated legislative system. I've bolded what the social scientists would call actors, so agencies, and then non-bolded are policies or regulations. And so I'm really going to pay attention to the regulator, the Accord Act, environmental assessment processes, and environmental assessment follow-up. So in Newfoundland and Labrador and offshore, there's only 4 production projects. So if you live in the Gulf of Mexico, you think, man, this probably isn't even worth talking about. There's only 4 oil and gas production projects, right? But they are significant projects, and they are very far offshore. So between 300 and 350 kilometers offshore. And this means, from the regulator's perspective, is that they have ended up relying on industry self-reporting for oil spills or events that happen out there. So in our research, we dealt with these 4 production projects. I've numbered them throughout the talk, so you don't have to remember, but the important thing from the environmental assessment point of view is that they were sequential. So there were opportunities, many opportunities to improve the environmental assessments as the production projects came in. And these are the operators. And the other thing that I want to point out is that the 2 earliest environmental assessments had the most stringent types of environmental assessments in Canada. They were review panels. And then the latter 2 were downgraded to what was called comprehensive study reviews. And even though they have these different types of EAs, I'm just saying environmental assessments for all throughout the talk. And then the other important thing is that these decisions to approve these oil production projects are long lasting. And so, for example, Hibernia started producing oil in, the EA was in 85, they started producing oil in 97, and they've gotten extensions for the project to go to 2040. So, the decisions that are made around these production projects are quite long lasting. So when I started doing oil and gas work, my colleague Janet Russell joked to me that it's a deep, dark hole, and boy, she was certainly correct on that one. So there were some basic things known about seabirds and platforms, and one of them was that we knew birds were attracted to platforms for a whole bunch of different reasons, which I won't get into, and that once they're at the platforms, there are species that are highly vulnerable to tiny amounts of oil pollution, such that a hole on the plumage compromises their thermoregulatory capabilities. This is very cold water, and the bird can die of hypothermia. And then birds that are attracted to the platform at night can fly into these gas flares and crash into the platforms due to platform lighting. So you recall that I said there's somewhere between 20 and 60 million seabirds on a 500,000 square kilometer system. And so understanding the impacts of offshore oil and gas in a highly variable system where you have many dozens of species that have huge amounts of variability that is both spatial and temporal makes it a very significant challenge to figure out what the impacts are. So before I get into the environmental assessment primer, I just want to talk about the importance of some relationships that I formed in graduate school. Janet Russell, who's on the left, and Joanne Ellis, who's on the right, were two women that I met in grad school, and I have collaborated, and I started collaborating with them on oil and gas research when I started my postdoc. And the first thing that we decided to do, so Janet had founded her own NGO, the Elder Institute, is we decided that we would undertake this public environmental audit of the regulator, and that we would test this availability of information that was essentially testing a section of the Atlantic Accord and how the regulator was interpreting that section of the Accord Act. And we specifically identified data sets that were directly related to the environmental assessment. And we wrote a paper that essentially said we couldn't get any of these data. Right. So, and I do want to note that we also collaborated with another local NGO, the Natural History Society of Newfoundland and Labrador. And then in 2009, I had gotten my tenure track job. I was 5 years into it. I had tenure, and I ended up meeting some social scientists, and I started collaborating with social scientists. I'm still collaborating with Angela Carter, and I just want to flag she has a brand new book. It's hot off the press on Canada's petro provinces, and both Anna Zalek and Angela Carter are essentially environmental politics type people. And this was super useful because I learned a huge amount about environmental politics and political sciences and having a different perspective. So your primer for environmental assessments, and I'm skipping a whole bunch, so I'm just giving you the basics. There's oil production that starts, and all kinds of things that are done, seismic testing that could impact marine life. But then they may have a significant discovery. An operator proposes an oil production project, and that triggers environmental assessment legislation. And in the environmental legislation, the EA identifies what the possible effects are and what the mitigation strategies are for those possible effects. And then they decide whether the predictions are significant or not. So during this line of processes. The EA is reviewed by federal agencies, it's seen by the public. There's an opportunity where money is made available by the government to be an intervener, where you can do a really detailed review of the EA. And then in the two latter environmental assessments, where they weren't as stringent, there were commissioner reviews that essentially looked at the whole thing, looked at what everybody said, and made recommendations to the regulator on what should be done. And then importantly, there's what's called EA follow-up, and this is verifying the accuracy of the predictions. So were the predictions right? Throughout the 4 environmental assessments, I'm just giving you 3 here, there were changes in what constituted a significant effect. So in 97, it ranged from 1 to 10% or greater than 10% change in a population. In 2000, it was the bar was raised and a significant effect was 10 to 25% or greater than 25% change in the population. And then there's a temporal and spatial element added to that. And then in 2010, they completely got rid of numbers and instead said that a significant effect is one that affects marine birds, causing a decline in abundance or change in distribution of a population over more than 1 generation. So the criteria, even to begin with, was difficult to achieve a significant effect. And importantly, only predicted significant effects are included in the legislated EA follow-up. So if we considered one of those environmental effects significant ratings and applied it to this highly variable system that's large in space and there's lots of different species and a great deal of abundance seasonally, in that abundance. So we would need to know the numbers of birds in a particular area and how those declines and whether declines have happened. But the EA predictions were not species specific. And also with the exception of the first one, there was an absence of modeling to evaluate this non-significance. So for example, the third EA said that it was not significant if a seabird population declined 9% over a year for 100 square kilometers. So there was no modeling to evaluate that. So it was unlikely, and indeed it didn't happen, that there were significant predictions for the effects that were identified on seabird populations. From the beginning, seabirds were noted as being an important factor in understanding what the impacts were from the oil and gas industry, and because of their abundance and vulnerability, particularly to oil pollution. So the first example I'm going to give you that I think demonstrates legislative and regulatory weakness is on seabird attraction to artificial light. So Bill Montevecchi has a great review on this issue. Some species, like storm petrels, appear to be the most vulnerable, and it's really well known and very old. Some of the earliest papers in the AUK were, 1890, were about seabird wrecks from light. And this is a photograph of a ship in Alaska in the Bering Sea, where this small boat had incandescent light bulbs going, right? And they got a significant storm petrel wreck. We have one of the most globally significant populations of Leach's storm petrels breeding in Newfoundland, upwards in the millions. So there was a great concern about the issue of storm petrels, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the other species, and I'm so happy that I could work in a photograph of crested auklets in this talk, which is a species I studied in my PhD, and that there have been some instances where owl also seem to wreck due to light. And Dick and Donaldson in '78 talked about a boat again in Alaska almost swamping due to crested auklets coming aboard. And then Francis Weiss et al. And Marine Pollution Bulletin talked about in Newfoundland and Labrador observations of thousands of dovekies circling an oil platform at night. So outlets may also be vulnerable, but likely it's more the petrels that are the most vulnerable to light pollution. Environment Canada is Environment Climate Change in Canada now. I'm just going to say Environment Canada throughout the talk. Their primary mandate is to enforce the Migratory Bird Convention Act, and they signed a memorandum of understanding with the regulator, essentially saying, we're just going to, we'll provide you advice about how to protect migratory birds. And the regulator considers that advice, and that's all they can do if they wanted to. Right. So Environment Canada says, here's our advice. The regulator says, okay, we'll take it under consideration. So I put some of the work that we did in purple, just so you knew where I was going. This is some research that we did, Angela Carter and I did, to trace the origins and development and discussion of mitigation measures for seabird attraction to artificial light. We reviewed a bunch of different documents, including environmental assessments. And then we also used an act in Canada, which is the Access to Information Request Act. And we requested all data on birds that were collected on the platform. And I'll tell you about that mitigation in a minute. And this was for 3 out of the 4 platforms for 11 years. The issue of seabird attraction to artificial light was flagged by an intervener, and I just ran across this again, and I wrote Bob Gibson last night and said, I'm giving you due diligence because I've missed your statement before. And so as he was hired as an intervener on this EA in 1985, and he said, bird platform collisions are a serious problem and must be addressed. The prediction for the Hibernia platform was not significant. But the second platform, the Terra Nova, the prediction was significant, but Environment Canada identified it as a serious concern of theirs. And I believe because at this point there were some stories of lots of petrels being attracted to the Hibernia platform, and Bill Montevecchi tells a story of workers sweeping petrels off the platform. Right. So the review panel recommends that the operator the board, the regulator requires the operators to study seabird attraction to test this, and if there's any mitigation which could be applied. So that's 97. And in 1999, through a contract, Bill Montevecchi and his crew did do a study. They did a literature review, and then they laid it out. And they said, here's an experimental study that could be done on the platforms. And so it was the plan. It's a plan to study, is seabird attraction to platforms a problem? And the same year, in 1999, there was what was called a storm petrel handling protocol that was developed both by an Environment Canada biologist, John Chardine, and an oil and gas industry worker. And the protocol was that the operators were to follow the number and fate of the birds that land on the platforms, and they were supposed to record the environmental conditions when the birds were found. And the authors of this protocol made it very abundantly clear and stressed that we needed the environmental conditions. Was there flaring? Was it foggy, et cetera, so we could understand where you get these episodic wrecks on platforms. And then this protocol was applied as environmental assessment mitigation in subsequent environmental assessments. So the third environmental assessment, the White Rose, their prediction, I give you the predictions specifically for gas. And what was great about the White Rose environmental assessment is that they provided an additional piece on the prediction in that they gave it a scientific certainty rating. So was the information used that made the prediction, how certain was the data that was used? And then they also gave it a confidence rating. And I called it, do we have a clue rating in shorthand? And the prediction was not significant again. Environment Canada repeated their concern again. And the review commissioner for the White Rose also repeated the request to the regulator to study the issue again. So we did get some data from Environment Canada through our access to information request, and this was published in Ellis et al. Just briefly as a big review paper on the impacts on the offshore in general. And you can see from 4 years of data, 3 production platforms, the dead birds don't seem to be a lot. There was some episodic moments where maybe lots of petrels were on the platforms, but in general it might not be seen as a problem, except when we got the reports, there was no records of association of anything on environmental conditions, and there was no indication that the operators were actually following a systematic search, which led us to believe that, in fact, the data are not that good. The operators were not following the protocol, and the regulator was not tracking, nor was the regulator enforcing this issue. So the 4th environmental assessment, Hebron, again, it was predicted, it was not significant. Environment Canada in 2010 says they'd like to see standardized searches and releases, and also understanding environmental conditions experienced at the time of the strandings. And Environment Canada also asked that seabirds be part of the legislated follow-up. If something is significant, it automatically triggers this environmental assessment follow-up, and that legally obligates the operators to do environmental assessment follow-up. But they were not put on the EA follow-up because the prediction was not significant. So this is a summary of this long, sad story of lost opportunities to try and understand the issue of seabird light attraction. And so we go down here, and I just want to highlight, in 1999, a reporter went on to the Hibernia platform and observed Leach's storm petrels flying into flares. And he published this story, and he likened the petrels as Icarus flying into the flame. He published this story in an Air Canada en route magazine. And this observation ended up being used repeatedly in environmental assessments as one of the only observations that we had of birds flying into flares. And so there's this repeated neglect to try and understand the issue. And in 2015, Sabina Wilhelm et al. Indicated that Leach's storm petrels are declining regionally, and it's so significant now that they're being assessed under the Committee of Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. And only after some, at least 20 years of this issue being on the table, is there now a study that is being done on whether it's an issue. The study is actually being done on the platforms. So I gave a variation of that section of that talk at a public conference that involved environmental assessment practitioners and the oil and gas industry and academics. And at the end of that talk, a higher up in the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, who shall go unnamed, actually I don't remember his name, his hand was the first up after I talked about seabird light attraction and this negligence. And this is what he said to me: just because you have some pet interest in birds doesn't mean the industry has to deal with it. So in 2010, there was a Deepwater Horizon blowout, and this ended up having Canada having some self-reflection as to whether they had the capacity to deal with a similar issue. And so the regulator made this big deal. They did a press release and they said, we're going to release the oil spill response plans for the operators. And this may come as some surprise to you that in Canada, the oil spill response plans weren't actually public documents in 2010, right? So they released these oil spill response plans, and Janet and Joanne and I think, okay, this is a good opportunity. We're going to ask for some of the data we asked for before and kind of see if anything has changed. And I'm going to focus on small spills. This is chronic oil pollution, not the big ones. And this has been on the table since Hibernia, and Environment Canada had repeatedly said they were concerned about the impact of chronic oil pollution on seabirds. So we asked the operator for both the spill response plans, and we got them. And then we also placed an access to information request for all of the small spill reports, and we asked for the raw thing, right? So that we got hundreds and hundreds of pages of PDFs, which cost $1,700, which was great that we had a research grant that we could pay for it. So the plan was we have 4 different operators. It was three different operators at this time. And we were going to take their spill response plan and compare it to how they actually responded to a spill. So that was the plan. Except when I got the oil spill response plans, there was confidentiality stamped all over these reports. Exxon Mobil use only. And I went back to the regulator and said, are these really in the public domain? Can I actually be citing these documents in a manuscript? And the regulator says, no, you need to go ask the operators. And I said, no, like you're the ones that just released these plans. That's your job to tell me whether they're in the public domain or not. And the regulator ended up citing me a federal court decision, Husky versus the CNLOPB, in which the federal judge favored with the Offshore Petroleum Board and said the public interest alone does not justify disclosure of reports and information generated by the offshore petroleum industries. So I very much did not want to end up in court with ExxonMobil. And so I revised the methods, and there was a generic report put out by the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers that had the offshore operators plans, but it wasn't per company basis. So we had spill response plans, a generic spill response plan, and we could compare that to the spill reports. So the spill response plans said for small spills, and this is industry defined, 50 barrels or less, I think I have it here, less than almost 8,000 liters. And that might not seem like a small spill to you guys, but it's totally a small spill when it comes to the industry. And so, so for small spills, they say you always have to watch it. So you surveillance it and you estimate how big it is. You look at the sheens. Environment Canada's seabird protocols should be followed. But they recognized that the workers are not trained seabird specialists, and what you really need are Environment Canada people who can ID seabirds properly. And I love this because one of the lessons which I didn't put on here is that there's a job for seabird specialists out there. So here's the data from the small spill reports that we got. We got 300, there was 381 spills, and we filtered those out, right? So we were like, okay, well, they're not going to do, good observations at night. And so we're just going to do daytime spills with good visibility, and that ends up being 220 daytime spills. Of those, only 5% actually said anything about seabirds and whether it was a negative observation or a positive observation, which led us to conclude that the regulator's MOU partner, Environment Canada's concerns that they repeated throughout several environmental assessments has been completely ignored. So I've gone through 2 examples that I think demonstrate some issues, regulatory issues, seabird attraction to light, and chronic oil pollution. And all of this, including some other things which I don't have time to get into, could have been resolved using trained independent observers on the oil production platforms. And these requests have been made repeatedly, including by interveners, the Natural History Society of Newfoundland and Labrador. It was a recommendation from the Terra Nova Review Panel. It was a recommendation from the Review Commissioner. And then in the last EA in 2010, the Review Commissioner noted that for some reason, there was a lack of trust between the environmental NGOs that were doing the intervening on these EAs and the industry. And the Natural History Society of Newfoundland and Labrador, whose name has changed, again asked for trained independent observers and that they would provide a validation of the 6 environmental safeguards. And they're like, what do you have to hide? And throughout this whole process, the regulator repeatedly rejected the option of having observers on production platforms. So in this final section, I've got some various thoughts and conclusions, but I want to start with something that might surprise you, in that there was an industry-related helicopter crash. So remember that these platforms are 350, they're way offshore, 350 kilometers offshore. And there was a helicopter crash where 17 people died and there was 1 survivor. And there was an inquiry was called, and the Honorable Robert Wells, who just died at the end of October, led this inquiry. And this safety report just came out. So this is October 2010, right? The Deepwater Horizon disaster is still going on, but it's looking like it might be solved. Angela Carter and I were working on a policy brief, which I'll talk about in a minute. But when I read this safety inquiry, Robert Wells said that the CNLOPB, the regulator, needs to be very concerned that they are not a captured regulator. And Shapiro defines regulatory capture as when the agency consistently adopts policies proposed by the regulated entities. And he was suggesting this in terms of safety. And we actually got to talk to him in person, and he was saying that his mandate was all about safety, but absolutely you cannot separate out safety from the protection of the environment. So we argue that this repeated examples of ignoring MOUs, partners' concerns on light attraction and chronic oil, with predictions that have high uncertainty that had never been studied up until 2017, where seabirds were not in legislated EA follow-up programs, even though the MOU partner specifically asked for it. Operators not following protocols that are used as mitigation measures, the regulator not enforcing those protocols, and then the regulator repeatedly rejecting trained observers on production platforms is, in fact, a form of regulatory capture. So we very much need independent observers on production platforms. And I'll say there are independent observers on offshore oil and gas exploratory vessels, and they have added to the data set. But we need them on production platforms, and any future production projects need to include seabirds in the legislated EA follow-up. And then Angela Carter and I have twice recommended independent environmental authority once on the heels of the Deepwater Horizon in 2011. And then again, and this is following on Robert Wells' safety inquiry where he recommended an independent safety authority. So I would not want to leave you with the impression that there has been no research on seabirds in the offshore for decades. There has been Eastern Canada Seabirds at Sea program that has been funded by the oil and gas industry. And there has been a rich history of research out of academics and Environment Canada, both in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. And these studies on seabird ecology are an essential contribution to understanding the impact of the industry on marine birds. But the challenge is to be linking these programs, particularly the Eastern Canada Seabirds at Sea program, to environmental assessment predictions. It's the environmental assessments that are driving the whole questions. So here are my lessons. I'm not reading them all. I'm going to highlight a couple. I would have saved so much time had I really sat down and started reading the legislation right at the beginning. And so I recommend, if you're going to embark on this, to start that or collaborate with somebody who can read legislation. It's really important to collaborate with local ENGOs because they have standing. I am an academic living in Toronto, and I'm critiquing offshore oil and gas in Newfoundland and Labrador. I don't get anything from the regulator. They never send me anything unless I'm asking for it. And so it's very important to collaborate with local ENGOs. If you have any capacity to influence how environmental assessments predictions are being made, having these certainty or confidence levels around each prediction, I got a huge mileage out of that particular environmental assessment that had those ratings. And then finally, I have focused my efforts, we have focused our efforts almost entirely on the regulator. And even by doing that, it comes with risks. So I have a graph that I made here of media interviews that I've made over the years that were specific to the oil and gas industry. And they have been involved in, the regulators have written rebuttals to journal articles that I've read. They have written my boss when I have responded to an Auditor General report around the oil and gas industry. There's a big take up on understanding the offshore oil and gas in Canada during the Deepwater Horizon. And the last point I want to make here is that, sometimes when the oil industry is down is not a great time to do a press release, because you might not get a lot of take up on that, because people don't want to kick an industry when it's down. And I'll say, there is an academic in Canada that did end up in court, a very lengthy court battle with a mining company that they critiqued in a book. So it's not unreasonable to just say focusing on the regulator. And my final lesson is that unless you really thrive on conflict, you shouldn't also study cormorants. So I want to thank the Waterbird Society and the local organizing committee. And it's been an honor to kick off on the first virtual Waterbird Society meeting. And I'm looking forward to both your questions and to meeting in person sometime in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Gail. I think probably the best way to entertain questions is to just let me know in the chat if you've got a question, and I'll call on people kind of one at a time. Any questions or comments? Oh, Dave Moore.
Hey, Gail, that was great. Depressing, but great. I don't even know how to frame this. I'm shocked. But like when the original environmental assessments were done, was there no, like a lot can change over 50 years. You can get, climate induced changes in distribution. You can get all kinds of things happening, establishment of marine protected areas. Like, was there no, we're going to revisit this every 10 years. And you're also, the original assessment, you're working with incomplete information. So I'm really shocked that there's not a periodic, especially that it's set up that the operator, data collected by the operators, what triggers a review of the EA in the first place. Is that correct?
There's a lot that undoubtedly goes on behind the scenes. But what I can say is that the regulator, so the regulator is this arm's length from government, and they have employees that are have knowledge about environment, but the board, which is 3 appointees from the province and 3 from the feds, none of them have experience. They tend to be oil and gas workers that are rotating in. And so, the phrase that I didn't use, which Bill Menovecki and others have often used, is that the board is in a conflict of interest. So, the mandate, the Atlantic Accord mandate, was really set up as a revenue sharing agreement, not around protecting the environment. And so, there's undoubtedly conversations that go on between Environment Canada and the regulator, but I think the MOU that was signed, it gives Environment Canada no power, like no power. The only power Environment Canada has is to decide whether they're going to sign off on some permitting. And it looked like the last EA that Environment Canada was actually going to put their foot down and say, we want seabirds on this EA follow-up, because that would mean you do have to check in. You have to check in annually. You have to show that it's not having an effect. It's not going beyond the prediction. And but even then, apparently the operator said, we'll work with Environment Canada and do something. And they said, okay, then we'll just proceed with that. So I think, this system is so variable. And the only way you can really try and understand it is being on the platform. That's the only way. And so, at any rate, your question brought up a lot, and I'm not sure if I actually answered any of it, but thank you.
Gail, Erica says, what happened to the person who ended up in court? I think the academic.
Yeah, I'm not sure. They might still be in court, although I haven't gotten. There was a certain kind of lawsuit called a SLAP, and they were in court for over a year, and they were asking for help from other academics for their legal fees. And and I've asked my institution. At any rate, I do not want to end up in court. That is not a good use of your time, right? So I've very much been really careful to be focused on the regulator, because I do think if you can kind of force things, and not just the regulator, but the politicians that are making the legislation, right? So even though this talk was all about the regulator, ultimately, the regulator is their whole mandate is on policy and legislation that's created by politicians, right? So you can get it changed, but Newfoundland and Labrador are so much in the hole right now, like they are just totally screwed, right? Because they switched to oil and gas as their savior out of economic disparity, and now the price of oil is like negative. And major projects are being canceled, and the province is totally in the red. And so they have really not done well in trying to diversify their economy.
Kate Schlepper writes, thinking about your lessons learned, do you see any advantage to living in Toronto as opposed to locally in Newfoundland?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have colleagues who became quite vocal about offshore oil and gas, who are at Memorial University of Newfoundland. And, one of them was threatened to have his funding pulled because he was highly critical about a major oil spill response that was done. There's been some significant oil spills. And the first one, yeah, like his funding was threatened to be pulled if he didn't pull down his website. Yeah, there is definitely an advantage of being in Toronto and making these criticisms.
Gopi writes, post-COVID, do you see any indication that the oil industry will be suppressed or will it be enhanced? The Canadian point of view.
Oh, it'll be enhanced. So this is what Newfoundland and Labrador are doing right now. They completely changed the exploratory drilling EA to make it this blanket EA, and their goal is to like double or triple oil production by 2030. Like they are all in on trying to get revenue from offshore oil and gas.
So Don Lyons writes, could you expand on your advice for early career scientists and the rest of us who want to help seabirds in situations where there are such strong vested economic interests?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Don. And I will tell you, like, so in 2008, we had a paper come out that was very critical of the regulator around oil spills, oil spill predictions, follow-up, et cetera. And we did a press release the day the paper came out, and it completely caught the regulators off guard. And they were so mad. Like they were angry enough to write responses to the journals, right? And to the journal. And this was the year I was supposed to get tenure. And I was so freaked out about it, right? So I will say it's better if you can do it when you get tenure. But like to try and seek out, if you don't have tenure, to try and seek out sources of money that are not oil and gas related, because it's so important to be able to critique a system that isn't dependent on funding from that system.
Ricardo, you had a question.
I don't know if that's enough advice, except for, I think there's so many, all these environmental assessments have so many opportunities to be looking at, the assumptions that are made around the predictions and whether there's good science or not behind them. And they're full of ideas for scientific research, full of them.
So Gail, my question, if this is a question for you or you can answer it, but has there been any attempts to use bird-friendly lighting? Is there such a thing? I know for sea turtles, for example, down here in South Florida, there's turtle-friendly lighting to keep them from disorienting when they're hatching. I don't know if there's anything like that for birds.
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Ricardo. There has been some work in the North Sea on that. And I will say that the last production project, Hebron, which is ExxonMobil, has tried to do some shielding on the lighting. They made the platform in Newfoundland, right? So they made the platform from scratch. So that gave them an opportunity to try and do some mitigation, but they are still flaring at night, right? So, and these flares are huge, and they can be easily seen by satellite, right? So they're like a beacon for storm petrels. And but yes, they have tried to do some modification of the platform lighting.
Kate Sheehan has a question about rating calculations.
Hey, Gail, thank you so much. This is super interesting. So when it comes to the ECs and the ratings and all that stuff, for sure, just because they found something was not of concern or whatever doesn't necessarily mean that's the case. And I guess I'm curious, when it came to some of the calculations, did you dive into any of that in terms of like what might be like tricky data to get, like, because if they're not seabird specialists, they don't have biologists on board. How are they doing maybe those population estimates to figure out what's going, were there things that were in there that seem like maybe too much information that they're just not able to capture, and they're never going to be able to come up with a rating that's going to show that it's a concern? Yeah, sorry.
No, it's a great question. So I'll just start that there is a fundamental difference between how an environmental assessment happens in Canada and the US. And in the US, the government pays for it. The government has all the data that go into that environmental assessment. But in Canada, the operators pay for it. And so there may be all kinds of stuff that they're doing that you don't see. So I agree that it is unlikely, given the criteria that are being applied, that you would ever get a significant effect on seabirds, particularly for the two examples that I gave you. But if there's so much uncertainty around the prediction, all the academic literature around environmental assessment says those kinds of predictions need environmental assessment follow-up. So even though it's not significant based on the criteria applied, there's just high amounts of uncertainty, and essentially they're just guessing, then that needs to end up in environmental assessment follow-up. And what was super interesting is you could, it's totally nerdy and actually kind of boring, but you could look at the changes in the prediction around the seabird attraction to light and go, oh, well, they changed it here, and then they changed it again, and then they changed it back, and then they changed it, like, so they're not even doing the same prediction through time. And there's no, and I think one of the take-home messages I should have said is that there was tons of opportunity for one project to inform another project, and they didn't in terms of seabirds.
If I unmute, Sarah Schweitzer asks if the Albatross and Petrel Conservation Act might help.
Well, that's a good question. I would think that the answer is likely no. And I know that Javier is on here. So I went early on in this. I was trying all kinds of angles, and one of the angles was this Canada Chilean free trade agreement. I was trying to get data, and I actually asked Javier, who was in Chile, to ask the Petroleum Board for data using this free trade agreement, which had this environmental angle to it. And they're like, no way, we're not giving you the data, right? And so the legislation in Canada, it's very strong. This Atlantic Accord Act has what's called paramountcy. It essentially, it outranks the Migratory Bird Convention Act. So it's a very strong act in that way. So I doubt that an international agreement would have any sway.
Have I missed anyone? Are there any other questions out there?
Those are great questions.
Gail, I just failed when I was introducing every single question, it started with, what a great talk, what a great job. So that was just a
Thank you, everybody.
Any final comments? I might have missed it. Is it possible to compare the effects of artificial light with other data, such as squid fishing boats?
Yeah, that might be a good approach. And in fact, I think one of the issues that might, there's probably lots of drivers that are causing Leach's storm petrels to decline. I mean, it's such a concern, right? This Bacalou Island was 8 million birds, and there's a decline, right? And so a super abundant seabird is being considered for possible ranking on Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. But when Bill Montevecchi did this press release on light attraction, and then I ended up doing kind of following with him on that, I got some emails from some friends of mine who are fisheries observers in Newfoundland, and they were saying that that often fishing boats are running with all of their lights on, and there's actually quite a bit of birds being killed on fishing boats too. So I do think that it might be an approach. I guess the challenge would be two of the oil and gas production projects are actually ships. They're called FPSOs. The other two are gravity-based platforms, and they're much higher. So that would be a difference that you would want to compare, in that like the vertical structure is much bigger than a squid fishing boat. But yeah, there may be some data. I don't know that there are any data on the Grand Banks, but maybe the Pacific might be able to inform it. Thank you.
Following up on Don's question earlier, what do you think the next steps are for moving forward? How can the changes be made? Does this issue fall to policy experts, the justice system, ENGOs, or do you think it's a lost cause because there's no observers on the platforms?
Yeah, I honestly, I don't know that there are some good next steps, except that if there's another production platform, I think if I had a magic wand, I would say the next steps would be, let's change some of the legislation in Canada such that we can really get some action and have an independent environmental authority that is overseeing the offshore oil and gas industry. And because I do think there are opportunities to revisit some of these predictions, in that some of these companies have asked for extensions. So they don't do a full environmental assessment, but they ask for, we're going to develop another part of this reservoir. We want an extension based on the first environmental assessment. So at those moments would have been, great moments to go, okay, well then how about we deal with these seabird issues before we actually approve that. So I think there could be opportunities, but you really need a regulator who's willing, and you need politicians who are willing. Like I always just say, all we're doing is asking for more employment in Newfoundland to put seabird biologists on oil and gas platforms. And shouldn't that be a good thing? More employment, but no. So I, and it could be maybe some pressure externally from Canada might be a useful approach to highlight the issue. The problem is that we don't really know how significant the effects are, right? Because the projects are 350 kilometers offshore. There's no independent assessments, and they're not collecting the data. So how do we go? This is a really important problem when we don't really have any data to back it up.
Sarah has a comment here. She says, this is great information to take to the AFWA and Flyway meetings where I can ask CWS senior staff pointed questions. Arm me with the correct questions and I'll put them on the spot.
Yeah, that's a great idea, Sarah.
Don Lyons, I don't know the environmental protection details of the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, but I wonder if that's another possible lever. Not collecting data or protecting birds gives Canada an unfair competitive advantage.
Yeah, that's a good angle. And I'm not sure if that would fall under NAFTA. And I know, NAFTA has been recently renegotiated, so whether that would be part of it. But yeah, that would be a great angle. I actually ended up, I was going to quit all this oil and gas research, and then this call for bids, which is when they go to the oil industry and say, okay, go, come out and bid on a particular, plot of ocean that you can develop. A call for bids was made in a marine reserve, and the fishing community was outraged, and not for reasons which were good. And I was just like, how does this even happen? And now that's been my focus. That's my current research project, is comparing multiple jurisdictions. And this, it's much earlier in the life cycle of an oil and gas project. So I'm looking at it right when the regulator is opening up areas for potential development, and what are the decisions around that. But lots of good projects for people who are interested in policy and seabird conservation.
Dave Moore asks, is there any way to sue the operators, the regulator, for failing to meet the obligations under the accord?
You know, I think the regulator is very careful that they meet their obligations under the Atlantic Accord Act because of that reason. And, you know, and there have been positive steps that have been made. Like when I first started this research, they weren't even reporting the number of spills per operator. They were just saying, oh, there's 10 spills in the Newfoundland offshore. So you couldn't even compare an environmental assessment prediction to what was actually going on. And so the improvement has been that the regulator has changed the interpretation of the Atlantic Accord Act. But I don't know, like ending up in court with ExxonMobil, that, you know, that doesn't sound like a very good plan. And I think the MOUs, the Memorandums of Understanding with Environment Canada, fall outside of the Atlantic Accord. So you know, what I would like to see is Environment Canada really push back and kind of elbow their way back into, you know, environmental protection of the offshore.
So while people are deciding on the final question, I'm going to share my screen to advertise the rest of our, well, the kickoff of the meeting. Here we've got Wednesday. So tomorrow your council will be busy all day, council meeting. And then we'll start with welcome and announcements at 8:30 Eastern time on Wednesday morning. Gopi Sundar, who's in attendance here tonight, is going to give a plenary address to kick us off in the morning on Wednesday, followed by an international cranes and storks session, a general session, climate and conservation, and then in the evening, an international East Asian session. So you can find the details in the program that I sent. You can find me on Slack if you missed an email communication or having trouble connecting. I and the others will try to get that squared away quickly for you. All right, I think we should thank Gail for a wonderful kickoff.
Thank you,
to
everybody.
Our first
so great to see
meeting.
all the good faces. I'm looking forward to seeing you all throughout the week.
This bodes well for an excellent week, so thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Gail. That was great.
Yeah, they should open up
Yeah.
unmute.
New messages.
Patty,
Yes.
do I?
Hi.
Hey, good job, Gail.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna go get a beverage. I'll be back in a minute.
Do I end the meeting now, or?
I don't think so, but
Okay,
let's stop recording.
okay.
You should stop recording.